Judith Curry. Welcome to the podcast.
Well, thanks for having me.
Thank you for coming on. I wanted to start with the biggest question and something that you're often accused of. Are you a climate change denier?
Well, anybody who knows anything about science would never use a term like that. Um, Climate has always changed for the 4.6 billion years that the Earth has been in existence. The one thing that I do deny is
Mhm.
that there is sufficient certainty in all this to support these manufactured consensus about what's going on and what the policies should be. There's just too many uncertainties, too many different values in play. That's
Mhm.
what I'm trying to do. For example, my new book, Climate Uncertainty and Risk, talks about what we don't know and what we can't know. And it provides a different rationale for policy choices. So, thinking that we've got this all figured out,
Yeah.
that's what I deny.
So, where do you think this came from?
Oh, okay. People didn't, I was challenging um, the important people who are trying to push this consensus um, for political purposes, for their own career objectives, funding, all sorts of rationales. And I was challenging that, and I was getting too much publicity. I had too much influence. So they tried to figure out how to take me down. So they just started calling me a denier.
I think what we saw with COVID, it opened the floodgates uh, wide open. And now, if you questioned COVID, you were an anti-masker, anti-vaxxer. We saw it with that. We've seen it with climate change. But if you don't question the evidence and ask, is there more to it? They'll just regard you as an outcast.
Yeah, I know. And okay, science skepticism is one of the norms of science. It's the job of a scientist to question the evidence and challenge the conclusions. That's what our job is. It's not to preach and reinforce a politically manufactured consensus about a topic that's a political hot potato, frankly.
Right. And so you're the expert here, and I'm going to try my best to keep up. But you do refer to 97% of the scientists agree with climate change, right?
No, okay. Nobody who has any sense at all would deny that the climate changes. Okay, the question is what causes the climate to
Mm.
change. There are a few things that all scientists agree on. These are facts that the earth has warmed for about overall for about the last 150 years. By emitting fossil fuels, humans add carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. And these greenhouse gases have an infrared emission spectra that overall help warm the planet. Nobody questions those issues. But the most consequential issues we do not agree on. How much of the recent warming is natural versus human caused?
Mm.
No agreement on that. How will the climate of the 21st century play out? No agreement on that. Deep uncertainty on that one. Is warming dangerous? Now we're in the realm of values and politics. There's no prima facie reason to think that warming is dangerous. And then finally, will humans be better off if we urgently stop burning fossil fuels? A lot of disagreement on that one. And again, that's not a science issue. This is one for the politicians, the economists, and the technologists. So, I mean, a lot of complexity in play here, a lot of disagreement, a lot of deep uncertainty, and thinking that we should all accept these overly simplistic targets and deadlines and whatever that the UN tries to push on us. I mean, This is just really rather a very bad joke, in my opinion.
So, who's a 3%?
Okay, this whole 97% is made up. Okay, like I said, 100% of scientists agree on those few things, and then there's a great deal of disagreement. The 97% came from a paper where a bunch of activists, bloggers, um, did a survey of abstracts in the published literature and classified them as for or against climate change. And this is how they came up with 97%. For example, a paper that talked about cook stoves for people in India that was regarded as pro global warming, which is ridiculous because it has rationale independent of global warming, and those papers never even mention global warming, but they classified it as pro global warming, anyways. So that study was a complete joke. Okay, when you actually survey scientists, it depends, you can get anything ranging from 50% to 85% to 90% something who generally buy the global warming narrative that the IPCC has put forward. But it depends on who you ask. I mean, the population of climate scientists like myself who really understand climate dynamics, how the system works, it's a relatively small group of people. Got a lot of ecologists and atmospheric chemists and economists and all sorts of people in subfields that don't understand the fundamental dynamics of the situation. They talk about impacts and all of their funding and their whole career depends on there being a crisis. So of course they're
Mhm.
supporting it. And they call themselves climate scientists, and on one level they are, but they don't understand the fundamentals of climate dynamics, which is physics and chemistry based.
Right, because from what I understand, regarding terraforming other planets, let's use Mars for example. Uh, we'd use CO2 emissions to warm up the planet, right? Am I understanding that correctly?
I
Because
don't Well, we're talking about Mars right now.
no, yeah. So I'm
I
using
don't know much about Mars. So
no, I'm using that as an example because Elon Musk has come out and said in order to terraform Mars, he dropped nuclear bombs to warm up the planet and create greenhouse gases. See, I'm not an expert, so I'm trying to understand that.
to tell you the truth, I've paid no attention to that topic. So
So I guess what I'm alluding to is the greenhouse effect, and that's what's going on here. So the human behavior may be responsible for some of the climate um, change that is going on, but the current situation is that they're making it out to seem worse than it actually is, and that the world will come to an end pretty soon.
that's true. I mean, humans influence the climate in a range of ways. A lot of it is our land use, cutting down forests, building cities with a ton of cement, um, putting pollution particulates in the air, and also greenhouse gases. So there's a number of ways. Through our use of water, we influence sea level. Um, so there's all sorts of ways that humans influence our environment and the climate. I mean, the urban heat island, all that cement and what we've done, and the cities are much hotter than the surrounding rural areas. So there's lots of ways that we have influenced our climate. And that's, 8 billion people on the planet. Of course, you're going to influence the climate a bit.
What steps do you think we could take to mitigate that? Because it is a risk,
Yeah,
right?
we can't, no, we can't. Okay, first off, the weakest part of the whole argument is whether warming is dangerous. Okay. Just in the US, people are leaving New York and Illinois and they're moving
Mhm.
to Texas and Florida because they hate warm winters. Okay, the planet is greening. Okay, vegetation likes carbon dioxide. Agricultural productivity is way up. Um, Fewer people lose their lives from weather and disaster,
Mhm.
weather, hurricanes and floods by 2 orders of magnitude over the past century. So, I mean, we've adapted to what climate change we've seen. And like I said, there's no particular reason to think that's warming is dangerous. And there is really no good reason to think that we can control the climate. I mean, thinking that every piece of bad weather is caused by CO2 emissions is a fairy tale. So by, even if we were somehow successful in eliminating all fossil fuel emissions by 2050, we wouldn't notice any change in the weather and climate um, by the end of the 21st century relative to what's going on with natural climate variability. So, I mean, thinking that we can control this is an absolute fairy tale.
So why is this even an issue? Is someone profiting off of this?
Oh, yeah. I mean, this goes way back to the 1950s, the Rockefeller Foundation, the UN and environmental program. They're looking for, I mean, it's a view of the world that's neo-Malthusian, if you will. And the environment is fragile. We have too many people, and the only way we can solve this is worldwide non-governmental control through the UN. It's basically a power and a money grab, and people bought into it. A lot of agendas started to align with it. That they figured out how to scare people, and once you really dig deep, I mean, the slow creep of warming um, is an issue on century time scales in terms of a little bit of sea level rise. But beyond that, I mean, that's it. And even if we got rid of fossil fuels, there's so much inertia in the system, the ocean would continue to
Mhm.
rise a bit for another century or two because there's very long time scales in the oceans and the ice sheets. So thinking that we can control this is a fairy tale.
So there's really nothing that we could really do because what our behavior is, it's minuscule to global climate.
Um, we have some influence, but we can't unring this bell. We
Mhm.
have add CO2 to the atmosphere. We can't unring the bell.
Mhm.
And we're doing fine. I mean, population over the last 100 years has skyrocketed. People are thriving and prospering. Um, so, I mean, we've over the past 150 years, we've warmed about 1.2 degrees centigrade or 2.5 degrees Fahrenheit. And the world's populations have thrived during that period. So they're talking about a warming again of that same magnitude over
Mhm.
the next 100 years. I don't think it'll warm that much. Maybe it will. But, we did fine with the first 2.5 degrees. I mean, I think we can manage with the second 2.5 degrees. So, you know, if this whole issue hadn't come along, global
Mhm.
warming and fossil fuels, there would have been a natural energy transition over the course of the 21st century away from fossil fuels. I mean, there's a whole host of issues. They become more expensive to extract, a lot of geopolitical issues, air pollution, things like that. So there's reasons to move away if we can find better substitutes, and nuclear powers was certainly one of those. But then the environmental people put the kibosh on nuclear power. Fortunately, nuclear
Mhm.
power is now seeing a renaissance, and they can't build nuclear powers fast enough, as far as I'm concerned. But there's all sorts of silliness in play here. That is, Europe has just pretty much crippled its entire economy over this issue. I mean, getting rid of fossil fuels and trying to rely on wind and solar, and sending their industry to China or the US. So there's I mean, Germany, which used to be a powerhouse, has lost almost all of its industrial base. The UK, there's basically nothing left. There's no industrial base. And this is what
Mhm.
they've done to themselves over trying to think that the fairy tale that you can power up an industrial economy with wind and solar power. I mean, it's like I said, a fairy tale.
Because first we had global warming, then it went to global cooling, right? And then it's just climate change. Or has it always been like that? But people just choose what to phrase it as.
Okay, global warming, I think this is a better term
Hmm.
that reflects the overall warming of the planet, which is, I think, the main issue in play here. They dropped that one in favor of climate change because nobody was worried about 1 or 2 degrees of warming. Say, well, it warms or cools that much from day to day, or even much more than that. Why should we care about 1 or 2 degrees? So they adopted the word climate change. So then they could talk about a whole host of other things, droughts and hurricanes and all this other stuff. And they started trying to blame bad weather on climate change and fossil fuels and whatever. It's a way of making the whole argument and causal chain a lot fuzzier just by calling it climate change.
So they were using the term global warming, but people were saying, like, basically, you know what? I like a little warmer. It's nice. I'm like, actually, no. So people were not caring about it being warmer, so they had to change the tune to just climate change.
Exactly. So they could blame a lot of other things on the fossil fuels.
No, that makes a lot of sense. And there's another thing that you discuss. So you've been discussing this, that overall, the climate was changing about is it 2 degrees, right? Over time. And then it dropped down to about 1.5 that they were trying to claim.
Oh, the target. Okay, the target. Okay.
Hmm.
They measure a reference point from pre-industrial period, which was like 1750 or something, but we didn't have good observations back then. So they really talk about the end of the 19th century as a reference point. And since then, we've warmed about 1.2 degrees centigrade or 2.5 degrees Fahrenheit. You know, the objective of all the climate treaties is to avoid dangerous human caused climate change, but they couldn't figure out how to define dangerous. And they finally came up with 2 degrees warming centigrade or 4 degrees Fahrenheit above pre industrial. Okay. Just a politically negotiated thing. And then when it looked like we were able to stay below 2 degrees centigrade, they say, okay, well, let's make it 1.5 degrees centigrade so they can ramp up the alarm. 1.5 degrees, we're almost there, to ramp up the alarm and to provide maximum pressure on people to eliminate fossil fuels. So it's just all a political game. A very stupid, but nevertheless, I mean, so many countries have been playing along with it, but I think everyone's starting to realize that, look, we can't afford to do this. What's the real problem here? And once they realize that floods and cold waves and hurricanes and all these things aren't really tied to fossil fuel emissions or warming. This is a part of natural weather and climate variability. And then the motivation to do anything at all sort of becomes much lower.
So it's a political gain backed by corporate interests.
Well, no, people have. It's not just corporate interests. People want power. They want control. Okay, at UN, part of it's money, but that's not the only motivator. A lot of
Mm.
it is really power and this whole vision of non-governmental world control by the UN.
Okay. Well, well, so it's a whole global political agenda that is going on, and has people believing that it's more dangerous than it actually is. which that's basically what they do with every single issue. And I think the reason that I refer back to COVID was because COVID showed a lot of that and showed how much control governments around the world have over citizens. And after,
It was worse than that. It was the World Health Organization, and they're trying to get this big pandemic treaty where the World Health Organization controls all of the national responses. Okay, this is what I'm talking about, non-governmental world control. You're seeing it with the World Health Organization, the World Economic Forum, and the UN. I mean, it's not just the national governments, it's these global organizations that are even scarier.
so one organization has that much power over the world.
Well, they're trying, I mean, through the United Nations, the World Health Organization, and the World Economic Forum. I mean, Google those, do your research, find out who pays attention to them. A lot of the countries do.
And it all trickles down to our local governments, saying, our like the U.S. government, and then other countries, because there were some, not many, that didn't really follow along with what they were being told to do. I mean, in the U.S., there are certain states that were not really following along the guidelines that were being proposed.
Mhm.
But now, if you question any of the science, as we saw when COVID was happening, people were just getting canceled left and right, and they were being shadow banned online. Their
Some
voices.
people lost their jobs, completely marginalized. The most interesting story was Jay Bhattacharya. He's a epidemiologist at Stanford University, an extremely distinguished scientist, and he
Mhm.
authored the Great Barrington Declaration about, look, you know, what we're doing here isn't right. I mean, you can go outside, you're not going to get transmission if you're outside. The shots are potentially dangerous, they haven't been tested. We shouldn't be masking little kids, a lot of common sense things. And he got canceled big time. He didn't lose his job. But the key thing, how this story ends, is that President Trump is putting Jay Bhattacharya's name forward to be the
Mhm.
director of the National Institute of Health under his administration. So hopefully, with people like that in the administration, we can turn the corner on this nonsense that we've seen, particularly for the last 5 years.
Yeah, because I honestly don't believe that a lot of people are ill intended, at least the voters. But they're being afraid into submission, basically, to believe certain things that are being told to them. So if someone is told that climate change is happening at the global scale, like global warming is happening and it's dangerous, and you need to act now or the world's going to end, some people are going to believe it. But I don't think it's on the individual level that the effect is being caused. So if I turn
Yeah.
on the news and I see what's going on and I believe it, it's the organizations that are pushing the messaging forward. So the reaction of people calling you climate change deniers, some of them may not be ill intended. They may just believe certain other characters.
Okay. 5 years ago, people sort of believed what they heard,
Mhm.
the mainstream media, experts, and all that. After COVID and after the climate change farce, trust in the mainstream media and in the so called experts who are really amateur politicians trying to use their expertise to push their political agenda. I mean, trust in these people is at an all-time low. I mean, the mainstream media in the US is completely falling apart, as well it should. And so I think people have stopped being so gullible. because of the events of the last 5 years, the climate silliness and most significantly COVID.
And where do you think it goes from here? Because the average viewer of legacy media networks is about 70 to 77 years old. And a lot of the younger viewers are tuning into podcasts. But as we know, there's also a lot of malinformation or misinformation also. But for the most part, people have the access to get their own information. But at the same time, is is that information correct or not? So where do you
No,
think it goes?
okay, this whole issue of misinformation is a complete red herring and canard. There's a lot of
Mhm.
things, uncertainties, and we're not allowed to discuss, talk about uncertainties, debate issues, or whatever. No, one side has to be declared as true, and the other side has to be declared as misinformation, even though the justification or any of that is very, very low. We just have to say, well, we don't really know. There's a couple of different perspectives that we need to evaluate, and there's a lot of uncertainty here, and that doesn't mean you don't act. I
Mhm.
mean, my book, Climate Uncertainty and Risk, maps out strategies for how you deal with deep uncertainty in your decision making. So there are ways to move forward, but trying to call something misinformation, especially when it comes from, um, I think that whole word should just be dropped from our vocabulary because it's not meaningful.
Mhm.
There's a lot of different ways to interpret evidence in when you have a complex system, and when you're talking about human health or anything environmental, invariably you don't have enough data and the
Mhm.
systems are open and complex and whatever, so there's no simple answers, and we need to acknowledge that. And as long as we're trying to have some manufactured consensus about a certain truth that's really motivated by politics, and then you enforce that by calling anybody who disagrees a denier, and then you cancel them and they're purveyors of misinformation. This is not good for society, for
Mhm.
educating people, and for our policy making process. So this whole misinformation, I mean, get over it. That there's a lot of conflicting information out there. If you do your homework, you can sort it out. If you don't do your homework, I would advise you not to have a strong opinion on the topic. um,
Mhm. So there's the other term, malinformation, which is information to be factual but harmful, uh, that they've come
I
out with.
really have I really have no time for that. Um, Harmful to who? It's trying to protect the little people from the real information for their own good. I mean, I don't know that this becomes, to me, that becomes fascist, in my opinion. So we just need to let the information get out there. We need to have public debates on this, and people need to do their homework, make judgments. I mean, decide who they should trust. Do some digging into if it's a health issue that they're personally concerned about, then they have to dig into it. I mean, there's a massive amount of information available on the internet. Some of it's opposing. I mean, for instance, if I'm wanting to research a public health issue, I mean, I'll go to the refereed journal, the medical literature. I'll look at a paper, then I'll look at the citations and see is anybody criticizing that paper. And then, I'll evaluate it and form a judgment. But there are no simple answers to
Mhm.
these complex problems. So it's not about information, malinformation, disinformation. It's about a lot of different information that's not always easy to interpret.
Yeah, and
And often we just don't have enough information. So there's uncertainty there.
yeah, and the reason that I started this podcast was to provide listeners with information from all sides of the aisle, with no filter, really. I'm not an expert in many things, and I don't have much information on many things. But when I'm listening to a certain podcast or listening to a certain say I read the Wall Street Journal, and I'm using that as an example. So if I'm reading or listening to a certain something and I agree with many of the things that they're saying, I get a little uncomfortable because I feel like I'm not getting all sides of the information. And I think that's a problem with some people that use confirmation bias and disregard any other information. And that's
Oh,
why,
yeah. Yeah. People live in their little bubble, their little information bubble. And the reason I like Twitter is
Mhm.
because there's every imaginable perspective there. It's not, in my mind, biased in one way or the other. You get a full range of perspectives on a lot of issues. And it gives you a very convenient way of digging through it and making up your own mind. And sometimes you just, throw up your hands, I can't make sense of this. I don't know which side is right. And I'm just going to decide that I don't need to make a judgment because I don't really know. And then if it's something that affects my health, well, then I need to make a decision
Mhm.
about, how to manage my own health risk, do no harm, no regrets, rather than, take a drug or something or do something that might be harmful with potentially very little upside. So you just have to, figure out how to manage your risks. And again, that's in my book. The
Mhm.
third part of my book is really about risk assessment and risk management strategies for dealing with conflicting information and how to make decisions in that environment.
Yeah, and from what I understand, you were shadow banned on Twitter for a bit before Elon
Yeah,
Musk came in.
yeah, I was. Yeah, sure. Oh, yeah. And I've had podcasts ripped off YouTube and Facebook. Very innocuous. Um, but I'm okay. There's a few people who I've gotten under their skin who have too much power, in my opinion, who have done what they can to sabotage me. And so I've gotten on various lists of people who try to sabotage me. But if you read what I actually write, follow me on Twitter, I have a blog, Climate, etc. Most importantly, my book, Climate Uncertainty and Risk. Listen to what I have to say. And it's pretty non-controversial, frankly. It just doesn't tie into certain people's political agenda. And a few people want to take me down because they think I have too much influence.
And that's not good. I've also thought about it, and I thought that it may be a symptom of where these social media companies are located, which we know they're located like in the Bay Area, in San Francisco, and all out of California. So they may be influenced by the people around them to believe certain things to be true and all the other information to be harmful. So they do what they do is they try to censor people that don't go with what they believe because they actually believe in their heart that the other person is being harmful.
Well, it was worse than that because the Biden administration was very proactive in communicating with Facebook and Twitter about people to shadow ban and things not to permit on those platforms. So it wasn't just local Facebook monitors or whatever making
Right.
these calls, or even Zuckerberg. It was really heavily influenced by people in the Biden administration. And that is all over
Mhm.
as soon as Trump takes office.
Yeah, because Zuckerberg actually came out and said that he has been pressured to censor certain voices, right?
Oh, yeah. And the Twitter files, After Musk took over
Hmm.
Twitter, he had all the old emails and he allowed journalists in to dig through them, and focus on all sorts of what COVID was a big focus, and how this was enforced from the all the directives that came down from the Biden administration. It was very, very bad, and I'm glad that as of January 20th, that will
Hmm.
be all over.
Yeah, it's hard to be optimistic because there's people still out there with the same beliefs, but I do
They
have a
don't have the power.
true, true, uh, but things are changing for the better. After Trump won the election, it was a huge relief because the other side, it just felt like they had dark motives. And when Trump came in, and the people that he's actually getting in his administration, shaking things up a little bit.
Oh yeah, I think it will be shaken up a lot. It's already been shaken up before he's taken office. So,
Yeah, because if you look
I
at
mean,
what's
people don't have freedom of speech, and you don't
mhm,
have the information available to evaluate everything. I mean, democracy is going to suffer greatly. So,
yeah.
um, it's a very big issue in my mind, and hopefully it's going in the right direction.
Yeah, hopefully, I think about it with this podcast, having my voice silenced, and I'm just trying to spread information. Some of it I don't agree, some of it I agree with, but that's not really what matters. It's just getting the opposing voices out there, and getting as much information out there, and have people decide for themselves.
Exactly. It's good.
Yeah. But thank you for your time for coming on the podcast. And I know you have a busy schedule, so I really appreciate it. As I said, I'm not an expert in this field, but I'm highly interested because there are more interests than we know of behind all of this.
Oh, for sure. Well, I've enjoyed talking with you. Thank you for this.
Well, thank you.